Perfect. Thank you all for your patience. Thank you, Damon, for your patience in
Sure.
this little hectic conversation.
No
But
problem. Happy to be here for the ride.
perfect. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. Damon, just how are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Thank you for
Yeah.
having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time to come talk to us. And we're really excited to hear about the Ivory Highway, but also just a little bit more about you. So
Okay. Sounds good.
I think I'll just start by like reading your bio, giving everybody kind of a little taste of who you are. So Damon Tabor's work has focused on conflict, drug trafficking, black markets, and the environment. He's a journalist. His stories have appeared in The New Yorker, Harper's, Rolling Stone, Outside, Wired, Men's Journal, a bunch of others. His writing has been noted in Best American Travel Writing, and his Rolling Stone article, Border of Madness, was the basis of the Academy Award nominated 2015 documentary Cartel Land. Ooh, fascinating. Most recently, he produced The Trade, a 5-part documentary about the heroin epidemic, which premiered at the 2018 Sundance Film Festival and aired on Showtime. He holds a Master's of Science from Columbia Journalism School and is a recipient of a 2019 Whitting Creative Nonfiction Grant. His forthcoming book, that I'll throw a link in the chat later, The Mountain in the Burning Sky, published by Penguin Random House, chronicles the early pioneering history of U.S. Forest Service smoke jumpers, which are elite aerial wilderness firefighters, and their later involvement in covert CIA missions throughout the Cold War. Lynn Nottage was inspired to write MLIMA'S Tale actually after reading his article, The Ivory Highway, which deals with how wild elephants are illegally hunted down by, quote, contract poachers, and their ivory tusks are smuggled out of Africa and sold for profit. So, Damon, if I can just start with like kind of a general question,
Sure.
what made you go into journalism? Was there a spark moment, or is there something like, is it something you always wanted to do?
I I think I knew I always wanted to be a writer.
Mm.
I was always better at writing in English than I was at math or science. And my father was also a writer. He was a magazine writer and is still a writer. And so I had a working model as a child for a parent who would quickly pack up their bags and then disappear off to some far-flung place for a couple of weeks and then come back and then sit down in front of a typewriter, which those were what he was working on at the time back in the 1980s, and write really interesting stories. And so I had a little bit of a model for kind of what I wanted to do. And then I spent probably the better part of my 20s wandering around the US mostly and just doing, I don't know, things that I thought were really interesting to me. I worked at a wolf sanctuary for a summer, and then I built hiking trails in New Hampshire for another summer, and just things that I thought were really interesting. And then that I also thought, I'll turn these into magazine articles. They'll be sort of like, I don't know, contemplative meditations about nature or something like that. I don't know. And I quickly realized that the magazine business is really difficult, much like theater probably, and acting, and just a very challenging environment. And so I really wasn't getting anywhere, and I realized like, okay, I need to sort of pivot and try to do something different. And so I went to graduate school in 2006 for journalism, and that helped me just sort of get a better understanding of how journalism worked as an industry and as a business, and how to pitch stories, and how to craft like a basic article, which I really kind of didn't know how to do before that. And so I got out in 2007, which you may remember, was like right at the beginning of the housing crisis and the collapse of basically the global economy. So it was a little bit of a challenging time to try to then, get into magazine writing. But I eventually did. I started off writing really small, what are called front of the book articles, and they're the little short 300 word, 400 word pieces at the front of a magazine. And then it built up enough of those that eventually I started pitching bigger, kind of meatier, more difficult feature stories. And then interestingly, the first one I wrote was for Harper's in French Guiana for an editor named Ted Ross, who was there. And then Ted eventually went over to Men's Journal to be a features editor. And then he called me one day and he said, "Hey, would you like to do a story about ivory trafficking for us?" And I said, "Sure, we'll give it a yeah." That's kind of the dream scenarios when the editors call you and say, "We'd like for you to go do a story about X or Y."
That's fascinating, actually. I mean, I guess coming back to, you mentioned in your 20s that you kind of traveled around the US. Is that what connected you to doing like environmental and social journalism rather than like particular local journalism?
I think I've always had like, so again, my dad, like I said, the model for me was my dad traveling off to far flung places, usually. I don't know. He did some overseas stuff. He did his model. The kind of journalism magazine writing he did was sort of this adventure uh, magazine, right? Going climbing big mountains or skiing or going, boar hunting or things like that. I was a little bit less interested in that kind of story and a little bit more interested in. I mean, you can tell from my bio, I have like a particular focus in, a couple specific areas. And for whatever reason, I'm still not quite sure to this day. Like I've always been interested in criminal networks, how things function in black markets. You kind of sorry about the noise, but I think more often than not, those stories are abroad. There's a term that I think sociologists use called ungoverned spaces, and so more often than not, you can those kinds of stories are in places that are not the U.S. and also the United States is just so crowded with journalists that for me, it's just a little bit more attractive to go to a place with fewer of me,
No, that
So
does make a
sorry
lot.
to cut in really fast.
Oh.
Damon, we're having a little bit of trouble hearing you on this end, and I'm wondering if maybe it's because the microphone in your headphones has moved a little bit away from your head or something like that. And so if it's possible, I don't know if it's possible for you to take your headphones out, but if not,
Sure.
don't worry about it.
How's that?
It's a little better. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Then circling back to that a little bit, you mentioned being like doing a lot of traveling and publishing a lot in different journals. And, you mentioned like when an editor calls you, that's a really big thing. So is there a publication that means the most to you or like that has been the most impactful for you or people surrounding you?
I think for me as a writer, so like I mentioned, the first magazine that I wrote for was for a big feature was Harper's Magazine, and I think it's it's what writer it's a writer's magazine, and that they will give you a very long leash in terms of how you tell the story and how you write. They have a sort of broad diversity of tone. There's different writers telling different stories very different ways. And as a writer, you just love that. It's a chance to stretch like your creative muscles in a way that is not possible in all places. There's some magazines that have a very distinct house style. So New Yorker is a great one. All the articles are brilliant and they're smooth as glass and just absolutely, brilliantly reported. And they all sound like they have a very distinctive voice. They sound like a New Yorker article. And so, so for me, I think Harper's was and is just sort of a dream publication. And on the other hand, they're all great too. It's such a punishing. It's such a punishing industry. It's a really challenging, and it continues to get even more challenging every year, as for all the reasons we probably know. But I'm happy just to be doing this as a profession. I'm happy that it's I've been able to carve out a little bit of a niche for myself and make it a working concern most of the time. There's been some time. There's been some years of struggle. Yeah.
But moving that niche from magazine writing to book writing, with your upcoming book, The Mountain in the Burning Sky, about the smoke jumpers, like what sparked you to this topic in particular, and why a book, I guess, rather than a magazine publication?
Yeah, so it's really interesting the way the publishing and the magazine and the book world work and are kind of symbiotic. And so, for example, I, as a writers will write a story, they'll publish a story in any given magazine, and then very often, and this happened with the Ivory Highway, you will get book publishers or agents reaching out to you after it comes out and saying, "Hey, this is a really great story. Would you be interested in doing a book about it?" And I think for me, in almost all of the cases with, like, so for example, the Ivory Highway, I had gone as far as I thought I could go or wanted to go with the subject matter, if that makes sense. You know, a book, and this is my first book, so I'm not nearly close to done. So I'll let you know how it goes when I'm finished. But I did know at the beginning, having watched my dad also publish several books, you know, it's a much more involved, long process of several years. And I just thought, if I'm going to commit myself to that kind of project with that duration, I really want it to be something that I'm interested in and has sufficient depth that it doesn't feel like I've ever hit a limit with it, that I can just keep reporting and keep asking questions and keep finding interesting little byways to report on. And so this particular book, the subject, I saw a Washington Post article about 3 years ago, and it was about US Forest Service smoke jumpers who had died in Laos in 1961, if I'm getting the date right. And if you know anything about the CIA, they have a memorial wall at their headquarters in Langley, at the entrance lobby, and there's 100+ stars that represent fallen case officers and agents on that wall. And so they don't typically identify the names behind each star. So they're just an anonymous memorial. But in this case, they did. And they named them as smoke jumpers who had worked for the Forest Service, who had then ended up in Laos working for the agency. And there was enough background in the article about smoke jumpers who had been involved in other CIA covert operations during the Cold War, the Bay of Pigs, for example, in Cuba, Tibet, that I just thought, like, that's weird. Like, why were, smoke jumpers they're these guys that just parachute out of airplanes into, typically out west in Montana, Wyoming, and, places that are inaccessible by truck or car or foot usually. And it just was like, why were they in Southeast Asia? Like, what was that about? And so I started digging a little bit and dug enough to find out there was a long enough history there that I thought, this could be a really interesting book. And so that was about 3 years ago, and I'm a bit behind on my deadline now. It's maybe too interesting.
No, but that connects with theater a lot, is then you find a piece of subject matter that leads to more questions instead of
Right.
just answers. I feel like that is interesting that you continued that interest with that, and that led
Yeah,
to.
you want to be engaged, like constantly engaged, and
Mhm.
your curiosity peaked, at every turn in the story. And this just seemed like a kind of something of a dream subject in that way, but it just had so many questions and so many curious little detours that I could take. Why were they there? How did it happen? So,
And we're not holding you to any deadlines, but please
yeah, soon.
keep us updated.
I will. Thank you. Yeah, I'm holding myself to a deadline. It's been long enough, and I think my publisher will hold me to a deadline pretty soon.
I guess then with the Ivory Highway, you said that, you felt like you had taken it as far as it could go, but then, Lynn Nudge based MLIMA'S Tale entirely on it. So you have worked a little bit with television and film, like them basing their stuff off of your articles. Have you ever had that experience with theater? Can you tell us a little bit about that journey?
Yeah, no, this was my first entree into theater. And as I was saying before, so the story kind of traveled a very interesting and I guess slightly unorthodox route before it became a theater production. And so, in addition to agents and book publishers kind of reaching out to you after you put out a magazine article, television and movie people often also will, and they'll want to option it. And this was back in 2013, and so there was not as much of a hyper appetite for content like there is now. I mean, magazine articles, I think, get snapped up sometimes even before they're written, if you're a well-known enough writer. But even into 2013, there was still a lot of content getting sort of picked up by the entertainment industry. And so for this one, a couple different people reached out about optioning. We had the conversations; those didn't go anywhere. And then Catherine Bigelow, the director of Zero Dark 30 and Hurt Locker and maybe my favorite, Point Break, reached out, and she was interested. And so we had some conversations and she optioned it. And I thought, wow, fantastic. This would be great. You know, she was really passionate about the subject. She was really, she was deeply, she had done a lot of deep research about elephants. She was engaged in it. And, you know, her primary concern, I think, was doing something to raise public consciousness. And then I think she got busy with some other projects, as often happened. And so she handed off the story option to Lynn. And then I heard about it, and I just, you know, I remember thinking, like, it was such a difficult story to report and string together. You know, the article, I don't know if you've read it, but it's a, you know, it's like little pieces that are kind of strung together because it's such a difficult market economy to, you know, to penetrate. And I just, I had a hard enough time reporting it and writing it and making it a cohesive narrative. I just remember thinking, like, how will someone dramatize that into a theater production, which I know very little about. And she did, you know, and then she did, and then I went to see it, and she did an amazing job. It's quite haunting and quite spare and beautiful.
How did you feel seeing your work represented in that particular way? I mean, in that medium, I suppose.
I honestly just felt awed by her technique and skill, able to take, you know, this story and then turn it into such a, I don't know, like, lyrical and haunting, beautiful story. She really, like, you know, there were a couple moments in the story or in the play where I recognized something that had come from the article, but I felt like the rest, you know, it was her effort and her, you know, her work, much less mine. I think, you know, I'm grateful that it inspired her in a general, you know, in a very general way, but she did the heavy lifting.
I mean, the article promotes a lot of heavy lifting on your part, so I would not discredit that, but I
All right, thank you.
like
Yeah,
at some point, yeah.
it was one of the more challenging
Yeah.
assignments, story reporting subject that I've done. I think that I had done at that point. You know, before that, I had gone to French Guiana, like I said, for that first article for Harper's, and it was really remote. It was in the Amazon jungle, and it also involved trying to report out sort of the black market, but in this case, it was gold mining, and that was physically taxing and challenging, just because it involved going to such a remote, distant place and talking to people who, you know, who weren't particularly enthusiastic about talking to a journalist and exposing what they were doing. This was far more challenging, just in that by the time I got to the story, the sort of, you know, the scale of elephant poaching had reached such a pitch. It had really become this sort of industrial. If there's a model, it was almost like Walmart. It had reached like such a scale, and involved so many different people, and involved the, you know, like just the globalized economy and shipping and middlemen and poachers, and it was, you know, trying to figure out how to unpack all of that and report on it and get access just was quite challenging, and at a few points a little bit risky. And I should at this point I should give a shout out to the fixers and the local folks that made that story possible, which, you know, me as a person who has never been to Cameroon or China, journalists will go to a place where they're reporting, and they'll hire someone who's, you know, who speaks the local language. They know something about the subject matter. They can critically get you in and out safely out of different places. And so this, you know, the story would not have been possible without, you know, very, very smart, dedicated fixers.
Definitely. Well, Emily, I'd love to open up the chat and the floor to any questions. And in the meantime, I'm going to drop a link to the article that Damon wrote, The Ivory Highway, and a little bit of more info about your upcoming book. But
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
All right. I am going to turn on my video here so that I can show y'all the, say hi to everybody, the whole room. Hello, everybody. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you.
And now you're gonna have to stare at my face for a minute. So basically, the way I'm gonna work this is I'll ask for questions and then I can restate them to the two of you, just because I think it might be a little bit challenging to hear.
Okay.
So are there any questions in the room for Damon regarding Ivory Highway, MLIMA'S Tale, anything? Yeah, question over here.
In terms of dealing with the Ivory Highway, I work for a company that deals with banking and security in terms of protection. So when you were dealing with your fixers, doing your story, say Cameroon or in China, in terms of having to deal with the counterfeiting and the bribery or paying off folks to get access, how hard was that, and did they prefer certain currencies over others?
Could you hear any of that?
Just bits and pieces.
Great. So in terms of like working with your fixers and being overseas and perhaps maybe having like money to have to like change hands to get from A to B or to get X, Y, and Z, sort of a question about like what currencies were you working in if you're crossing borders and paying people off and stuff like that? Was there a currency that was preferable, maybe like the US dollar, or how did some of that stuff that you might have had to do that's maybe outside of exact yeah, right? Like, I'm not saying the word illegal, but
no. It's an easy question to answer because we just, I didn't do that. I wasn't. Let's see. I crossed one. So Cameroon. So when I was reporting in Cameroon, I just was reporting in Cameroon, so it didn't involve crossing any borders. I did cross a border from southern China into Vietnam to meet up with some traffickers there in Hanoi. And so, but just as a hard general rule, and I think most magazine journalists don't pay bribes or grease the wheels to get across borders. I mean, I'm sure that it happens in some cases. I do know that in the documentary world, things are a little bit looser just because it's more of a new medium. The sort of rules and standards about what is ethical and what's not are a little bit less rigid there. So I know documentary crews will sometimes pay for interviews or pay a customs official to get access into a certain room or something like that. I would not personally. I have not. I wouldn't. And I think the logic behind it, the ethical logic behind it, is sound. It just it interferes with the story and the source in a way that is potentially corrupting. You don't know what you're paying for. You don't know if you're paying, if somebody's telling you the truth. For example, if you give them money for an interview, you don't know whether they're actually just telling you things you want to hear because you paid them, or things like that. And so I didn't do it. It sounds like such a bit of a cliche, but people will often want to just talk and tell their stories in a way that often surprises me. Even now that I've been doing this for 10 years, people like to talk about themselves. Oftentimes they're I think happy that somebody is curious and engaged and interested in their life and what their day-to-day is like. That will get you a long way. In this story, in one particular example, where I did use some subterfuge and a bit of deceit, was crossing the border from southern China into Vietnam, and it was to get access to a fairly large trafficking syndicate that was operating out of Hanoi, and the only way to do that was to present myself as an ivory buyer. I actually presented myself as like a sort of a middleman intermediary for a wealthy US buyer. And it was really the only way to get access to people like that. They were just not ever going to talk to a journalist who shows up with pen and paper in hand and wants to tell their story. And so I'd never done it before. I never, in journalism school, they don't teach you to go undercover. I guess I don't know if this is a compliment or what. I guess I looked shady enough maybe that I could pass. I could pass for a slightly illegal ivory middleman trafficker, but it worked. It worked enough to the point, enough to get me access, and for about 2 or 3 hours of just seeing how this criminal group operated, actually seeing the rooms where they kept ivory tusks. It was pretty shocking. And then there was no other way to get in access to that level of the trade.
Wow. I have another question here. Go ahead.
How long has the ban on the sale of ivory been in place, and how vigorously is it being enforced?
So how long has the ban on the sale of ivory been in place, and how vigorously is it enforced?
Yeah, okay, so it's been a few years since I wrote the story, so I'm a little bit rusty about the numbers, but the international ban on international sale of ivory has been in place since, I think, 1989. And then what happened after that was there's a governing body called CITES, which I believe is part of the UN, if I'm remembering correctly. They are the governing body that monitors and in some cases enforces the trade in ivory. And so what happened? So what happened was, after the ban in 1989, and just as a quick aside, it is important to recognize the United States role here, because now the sort of global villain is China. They consume the vast majority of ivory from Africa, but before China, it was us, from about 1900. So I think up until 1989, it was the United States that consumed the vast amount of ivory from all the different countries in Africa, primarily in the South. And it was something like 26 million elephants around the turn of the century, around the 1900s, down to about 500,000 by 1989. So the U.S. demand absolutely decimated the continent's elephant population. And then, so after the ban was passed in 1989, CITES allowed the sale of an enormous amount of tusks from 2 countries. I think one was Botswana and maybe the other was Tanzania, but I can't remember, to China, which had a legal national market, inside China, it was legal to buy and sell ivory. And what a lot of critics of that deal and a lot of NGOs said was that just created kind of the perfect laundering mechanism, because you had ostensibly legal ivory. It was, say, 60 tons from these 2 countries. But then underneath that legal trade of 60 tons, you had hundreds of tons more of illegal that was being passed off, and so as legal. And so China has this monitoring system in place, where you go into like a little shop in Beijing, and they sell nothing but ivory, and there's a little piece of say a chessboard made out of, all the pieces are made out of ivory, and then there's a little picture beside it of that chessboard, and a description of it. And what that picture is supposed to indicate is that ivory came from one of the legal sources of the tusks that were sold from the 2 countries in Africa back in, I think it was 99 and 2008, something like that. But what happened is all these little shops are just selling the chessboard and its pieces, but keeping the picture, and then just using illegal ivory to make another chessboard with illegal pieces, and then keeping the picture right there. And so they'll sell 10, 15, 20 chessboards, and the first one was legal, but the rest are not. So it's, when I was there, my takeaway was that this is a poorly regulated and very, very leaky enforcement and monitoring mechanism.
Thank you. I have another question here. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much for writing the article. That's how I got this job. So, I guess when you saw the show, right, when you went to go see the Broadway version of it, there's this outline theme of the show being kind of centered around, I guess, the perversion of a culture, and like with you having gone into ivory shops and like your boots on the ground, did you expect like the anthropomorphization? I'm saying that word wrong. How do you say it? Anthropomorphization, whatever it is, of MLIMA on stage? Seeing that as a person, kind of, for me anyway, being in the show, it like blew up what it meant. You know, so
Shaq, come here. So this is a question from one of the performers.
yeah.
Okay, fantastic.
Sorry, I'm just curious. So like how did you learn anything new when you saw the show? Like, did you feel anything different? Because I feel like when you're there, you know, you're
Yeah.
witnessing this shit go on. Excuse my French.
Yeah, no, all good.
Yeah, when you see this stuff go on, you know, it's different than seeing it and then it'd be about people instead of elephants. How did you feel?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I was blown away. I didn't expect it. You know, as I was saying before we got on the Zoom, I know next to nothing about theater. So I'm sort of a blank slate when it came to seeing Lynn's play, which I did. I think it came out 2018, something like that. But I remember being really moved by just how she rendered an elephant, and there's such complex, amazing creatures, and I remember just being really impressed and awed by like the sort of lyricism of how she did that. And I also remember the white paint that she uses. I'm not sure if that's still, I would assume that's probably still part of the, and that really struck me. I thought that was really powerful and evocative. And so how it, all along this chain, everyone gets marked by their connection to these tusks. And so that really, that I thought was really, really powerful. And, the point to me that the play made in a very subtle way was that it's really difficult for anyone along this chain to have any kind of virtue, like moral virtue, when there's really oppressive, strong economic forces incentivizing everything, for them to behave absolutely unvirtuously. And I thought she did that really elegantly. And I found that in my reporting also. One of the first things I did was when I wanted to go out with the contract poachers. And in Cameroon, a lot of the poaching is being done by they're called the Baka. This is an impolite term that we don't use anymore, but people used to know them as pygmies. They're small stature, but a lot of them have been forced off of the land where they lived for centuries going back, as who knows how long, to create basically like protected reserves for animals. And so they now live in a state of intense poverty. And, for them, one of the skills that they have is tracking elephants and hunting, if not the only skill that's marketable, at least. And so they are often the ones who get used as, hired as contract poachers. If you're making, if you have the opportunity to make, say, $1,000 for a week's work versus less than $1 a day, selling gasoline in a market or cassava or something like that. I mean, if you're at that very far down, sort of at the economic chain, you're of course going to pick the $1,000. So I think that point, I don't know, to me, that point gets lost in a lot of the discussion about with NGOs and environmentalists who want to set aside, a lot of space, which is well-meaning in a good faith effort, I think, for game preserves and protected parks and things like that. But it really ignores also the human side. Like there are, people who actually live there, and, they are going to continue making what are for them pretty rational economic decisions, because they're just so deeply impoverished that there's really no other choice. It's sort of like, if you watch The Wire, it's like the David Simon thesis. Like people will work with the economies that they have. They don't really have any other choice. So anyway, that was a very long-winded answer to your question, but I hope I answered it.
Yeah, thank you very much. All right, I think we have time for one more question. I see one right here. Actually, we're going to do two. So we're going to do John, and then we'll go back to Andrew. Go ahead.
It seems to me that the turning point in the story was in Vietnam, where the boat owner and all of the poachers lost their money and changed hands to the Vietnamese and the Chinese. Is that typical, where there turning points where people just lose out?
Yeah. So is it typical in this type of trade where, there's a moment in the story where there's an attempted transaction and then that moment, for it is sort of stolen away. And so like, and the whole like chain prior to that, like loses out on their, potential reaping of the, sale. And is that type of sort of deviousness or sort of accidental shift or transition or is that typical in this type of instance or in this ivory trade where something will be going along and then something happens and like somebody along the chain all of a sudden is out but the thing continues?
Yes, I think with ivory, with the demand booming such as it was in China, that even if one small little piece of this long chain falls out for whatever reason, someone will fill that vacuum quite quickly. Mm-hmm. If there's an analogy, it's the drug war and drug trafficking. Mm-hmm. Say the U.S. Border Patrol or Customs, they managed to seize like 50 kilos of cocaine or fentanyl or whatever it is at the border. There's 350 also going across that they didn't catch, which will fill that vacuum. Or if some member of that, the particular cartel controls this plaza, if they lose some of their members, like others will quickly fill their positions. I mean, it's unfortunate with I think like a black market economy that's the demand is just that there's enough money flowing through the system that it will replenish and replenish itself and rejuvenate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrew, do you mind coming up here and asking your question? Would that be okay? Sorry, I want the performers to be able to articulate their questions.
Hi. Nice to meet you.
My question is, I want to return to the topic of virtue because I think that's one of the most interesting parts or aspects of the characters in the play. In the interviews that you did for the article, which characters did you admire, or which interlocutors did you admire the most, and which did you admire the least?
Interesting. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I would go back in terms of. I don't know that I would use the word admire, but with the Baka tribesmen that I interviewed, I would say like was absolutely sympathetic with the position that they were in. I think it's possible. It's a both and, right? Like it's possible, to find the killing of this really magisterial, sophisticated, amazing keystone species just abhorrent and tragic and like a devastating loss for everything, for us, for the ecosystem, everything, and also recognize like that they are making, like I was saying before, making decisions that they don't really have any other choice. I did find the next guy that I met after that, his name was Justin, and he was kind of a middleman in the sort of the Cameroon trafficking part of the equation. And so he would contract the Baka trackers to go out into the forest, spend 2 weeks, give them the guns. They would kill elephants, bring the tusks out, and then he was kind of the middleman that would bring them from the edge of the forest to, I think, probably Yaoundé or the seaport there, and then from there they would go to Vietnam or somewhere in China. And he was absolutely, I thought, an abhorrent person in that he just could not care less about what he was doing and the harm that he was inflicting. I remember he made this one quote, and I think it popped up in the play about, I had asked him if he, what are you going to do when your business dries up, which is to say when there are no more elephants. And he just saw them as like, a commodity, like salt or sugar or oil, something to be traded, and he would move on to something else. And he made this comment about how they were essentially like his girlfriend's dog who had jumped into bed with them, and he just thought was dirty and disgusting. And if it had been up to him, he would have killed it and turned it into pepper soup. And I remember hearing that line in Lynn's play, and it just, it was just like rapacious capitalism distilled to its finest point, and pretty loathsome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Audra, I'm going to turn it back over to you to wrap us up.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. Damon, thank you so much for just giving us your time and educating us, not even just on the Ivory Highway, just journalism and the work that you do in general.
My absolute pleasure. I'm so happy to have been asked and to participate. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
I'm sorry to get a chance to see the play there. I wish I could. Maybe I'll still be able to.
Yeah, MLIMA'S TALE is extended until October 9th, so
Oh, congratulations. Great. Yeah, congratulations to all you guys.
the actors in the room that I can't see, let's go.
Fantastic. We'll say goodbye from here.
All right.
All right, so keep us updated on your work, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
I will. Thank you so much, Audra.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.